And our first speaker for the quarter is a collaborative project between myself in the Department of Art and a professor at the University of Victoria named Nicholas Bradley. It's called The Ragged Edge. It's actually called The Ragged Edge, Water, Land, and Culture. Okay. Let us try calling Nick.
Hey.
Hey. Hi, Nick. Everyone, hi.
Hi.
Nick. Louder. Of course. So, let me... Nicholas Bradley is here as well. This is Nick and I. Nick and I have known each other since undergrad, so this is also a good moment to point out that the relationships you guys make here in undergrad will carry forward in life. We've both become professors in different fields in different universities. Nick is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Victoria, where he teaches Canadian literature and American literature. He coordinates a program in literatures of the West Coast. And so the project that we're about to talk to you about has a relationship to a general interest in literature of the West Coast, which obviously we're on. He's published numerous essays on aspects of contemporary writing, a number of books on various West Coast authors, and next year he will be the William Lyon Mackenzie King, who is a Prime Minister of Canada, or was a Prime Minister of Canada. I believe, is that the first Prime Minister of Canada, Nick?
No.
Oh, okay, so Canada fail. Research fellowship at Harvard University, where he will teach in the Department of English as well. So let's bring Nick back on the screen. There he is. And I'm going to bring up an image that Nick, just one image to serve as his background. He doesn't need to be the entire screen. Take it away, Dr. Bradley.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank you all for having me this morning. I'm thrilled to be talking to you. I wish I could be there in person, but this will have to do for today. So, as Jesse was saying, my areas of specialty are Canadian literature and American literature, but I have a particular interest in the culture of the West Coast, which, as I understand it, is a region that runs more or less from southern Alaska until the border between the U.S. and Mexico, which is your part of the world. And I'm very much interested in the cultural as well as geographical elements that make this a coherent or unified region. But I'm also very interested in the contradictions that this very large region encompasses. And one of the reasons I wanted to have the picture of Mount Rainier up for you is as a way of serving as a kind of shorthand for some of the differences between what my part of the region looks like and what your part of the region looks like. Now, Mount Rainier, as some of you may know, is near the city of Seattle, which is about 100 miles south of Victoria as the crow flies. And on very clear days, you can see Mount Rainier from here, from one of the local hills in Victoria. And whenever I see this, I think that it's a good reminder of the strange condition of living here. I'm getting a bad message on my computer. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, okay. So when I see this mountain from Victoria, I'm looking from Canada into the United States, and it's a useful reminder of the fact that we live in a part of the world that is made up of different countries, but also of different landscapes. And so when I see Mount Rainier, I can simultaneously see the ocean, and I'm reminded of the fact that this is a part of the world that's made up not just of the places where the land meets the water, but also of violent geological upheavals. And this, too, I think is one of the contradictions of the region. So what I want to do today is talk for about 20 minutes or so about some of the perspectives on the West Coast that I've come to have in my reading and writing, and give you some sense of how I view the region as a scholar of literature and as a writer myself. And I hope that as I talk about this, you'll get some sense of how Jesse and I view our emerging collaborative project. I am not myself a photographer, any more than Jesse is a literary critic, but I think that you'll come to see from his art and from my conversation that our interests have something in common. And I hope that what I have to say will serve as a kind of model, or at least an example for some of you of what you might do with people who work in different modes and different mediums from those that you work in. So here at the University of Victoria, I teach in a program which we call Literatures of the West Coast. And if any of you are in English courses as well, you may know that historically or conventionally, English studies is organized along national categories, so that you can take a course in British literature or a course in American literature. These are the normal ways of organizing the subgroups in English studies. But what we try to do here at my university is to take a different approach. So we begin with a different premise, which is that it makes sense to think about regions not only in national terms, but in international terms, in intercultural terms, and in terms that follow something of the geography and the ecology of the place that we live in. So my approach to literary studies puts geographic and social spaces at the heart of its investigation of literary and indeed other cultural works. And as I've been trying to say already, I take the West Coast as a difficult place to define. And this problem of definitions is always something that I come back to. And I think that Jesse's art, as he'll tell you later, also gets at this question of definition. We're trying to think about what it means to be here in our work, but it's very difficult sometimes to answer that simple question and to think about how to define what it means to be here. Where is here? What is this place? So my West Coast spans Canada and the United States, as well as many Indigenous territories, but its limits are neither self-evident nor fixed. And so part of what I try to do is to think about what it would mean to define this place, at least in provisional terms. And in part, the reason for inventing a new way of doing things, or a new disciplinary category, is to look at familiar material in a new way. And so by thinking about the Pacific Coast as a transnational and contradictory region, but also as the central element of study rather than as the background or setting, we can attempt to answer the question of how coastal lives are organized. How do we live here? How is here the same and different as the length of the coast is traveled? I was in Irvine in February, I think, visiting Jesse to do some work. And I've been there before, and I always enjoy visiting Southern California. But as always, I was struck by just how different it feels to be down there. But of course, in many ways, too, your lives and my lives are organized in very similar ways. In its most fundamental definition, I think the coast is the place where the land and the ocean meet. But this is not a fixed or a single location, but instead I think of it as a zone of contact that is characterized not only by tides, but by the continual but not constant motion of waves. So the very physical place itself is continually changing and hard to pin down. You can catch a glimpse of it, but it's very hard to see the thing itself. Very few people live in the intertidal zone, or indeed on the waterfront, but everyone who lives on the coast or near the coast is affected or described, I think, by this line of encounter, the line of limit between land and water. And coasts, as you well know, are highly populous regions. So here is a fundamental contradiction. No one can live on the coast itself, and yet coastal regions are highly populated. The historian John Gillis has written a remarkable study called The Human Shore, and he has suggested that coastal existence, which was once a demographic norm, is a defining characteristic of modernity, of our world. And he says that we live in a period of great migration to the coasts, yet we live there in a state of alienation from the place itself. So he says that although we live on the coast, we fail to understand it in some profound ways. And I think that he's probably right. And so I see my work and Jesse's work and the work of other artists who are doing things in this field as trying to come to terms with the place, trying to resolve this problem of alienation. So Gillis suggests that there was a time when coasts were a more significant part of humanity, and when the people who lived on them had a greater sense of belonging to this world. And now, he says, we think of coasts as the edge of something, as the periphery rather than the center of a world. And he claims that humanity's current relationship to the shore is that of the stranger, for after millennia of coastal existence, we have forgotten how to live with coasts and oceans. And he says that although people have long lived on the coast, it's only now that the scale and the frequency of the ecological threats to the coast have been as great as they are. And this is complicated by the fact that very few of us who live on the coast have an idea of how to live here in a sustainable way. And he claims that there is an urgent need to understand the dynamics of climate change in order to continue to live on the coast. But also, he says there's an imperative to draw on the adaptive strategies preserved in the historical record from times when coasts were a here rather than a there, places to dwell rather than just to visit. And so again, to the degree that there is an ecological dimension to the kind of work that I'm engaged in, it's a kind of inquiry into the past as well as into the future, a way of trying to understand how people, whether they're writers or artists, have thought about the coast throughout history. So there's an attention to time as well as to place. So dwelling in place, as I understand it, means paying attention to the question of what it means to be here, which I take as a question that is open-ended and is always going to lead to different answers. And it means paying attention to local conditions, which I think that writers and other artists have always taken as a primary condition for art, or a primary basis for generating the sets of questions that could lead to various forms of art. So as Jesse is going to tell you, we in January, I believe it was, the end of January, took a walk here in Victoria, which included the entire coastline of the city of Victoria, which is a route I know well. It's a path that I've walked many times. It's about 12 kilometers long, which is, I guess, about 7 miles. And in all of the times that I've taken this walk, I've never done it so slowly as I did with Jesse. This was, of course, because we were carrying a great deal of photographic equipment. But one of the advantages of moving at less than 1 mile an hour is that you learn to see things very differently. And this was an encapsulation, I think, of some of the strategies that writers and artists use in order to see the familiar in new ways. So they adapt various defamiliarizing strategies. And what became obvious to me while Jesse and I were walking at such a stately pace was obvious in a sense, but of course it's not obvious until you make it obvious. And this is that much of what happens along Victoria's waterfront usually passes unseen. So that the conditions of our lives, and in many ways the defining conditions of our lives, we usually pay no attention to. And so one of the things that art or writing can do is to serve a kind of revelatory function. It can make obvious what is not usually noticed. If you look at the history of coastal aesthetics, it seems to me that the default position or the locus classicus is the oceanward vista, the stance on the beach, looking out into the ocean. And many writers have created a sense of coastal place that's based on this constant, this tendency to look out onto the ocean, and the constant presence as well of the ocean in front of you, despite whatever may be changing in the background. But my particular conception of the Pacific depends as well on the notion that the coast represents a kind of dual limit, the edge both of the North American continent and the edge of the human perspective. So that the literature that I study is Pacific in part not just because it's about the literal Pacific coast, but because it's about the problem of trying to reconcile the human and the non-human worlds. So that many of the writers I study are ecological in the sense not just that they are writing about the natural world, but in the sense that they're trying to understand the world from a non-human perspective. And so they think about what it would mean to see all of the parts of the whole as if it were possible to see through non-human eyes, which of course, for those of us who are human, is impossible. So walking the coastline at a slow pace, I think, is one way of getting at this impossibility, one way of trying to make the impossible slightly more possible. And walking the municipal coastline so slowly revealed that in some ways the coast is not simply an edge or a neat limit, but rather a mesh of natural and human processes and activities. And the complexity of this mesh, the complexity of the coastline as a both natural and social space, comes into relief, I think, the more slowly you move through it, the more you attend to the question of time as well as space, moving slowly through this zone of contact. So I'll let Jesse tell you more about his photography, and now I'll try to give you a sense, more particularly of some of the literary perspectives that my work involves. And it seems to me that coastal landscapes have almost always been considered versions of paradise. And I was thinking of you all very recently. Our classes just ended here last week. You'll be dismayed to know as you begin another term. We're finished for the year. But one of the last books I was teaching my students is a collection of essays called The White Album by Joan Didion. And some of you may know this book. And if you don't, I highly recommend it. It's about Southern California, and I think it's one of the great books about LA. And there's an essay in this called Quiet Days in Malibu, in which the author writes about her time living in the late 1960s in Malibu. And it was then from the Malibu that exists now. But Didion describes it well, I think, as an idiosyncratic place, a place that's hard to come to terms with, but she knows how much appeal the very name has, even for people who don't know the place itself. And she writes at the beginning of this essay that Malibu tends to astonish and disappoint those who have never before seen it, and yet its very name remains in the imagination of people all over the world, a kind of shorthand for the easy life. I had not before 1971, and will probably not again, live in a place with a Chevrolet named after it. And I think this is true. Most people don't live in places that are as famous to everybody as Malibu, even if those people who recognize the name have never been there and never intend to go there. So this is a version of the California dream, but that dream, I think, attends coastlines the world over. These are places of fantasy as well, of course, as places of reality, as anyone who lives on the coast, as we all do, know. So if the coast is a fantasy, as I've been trying to suggest, it's also real in a variety of ways, not just real because we live there and it forms the backdrop to the reality of our lives, but it's real in certain physical ways as well. So one way to think about the coast is as a limit or a terminus, also a threshold or a point of departure, and it's these things at the same time. One way of measuring the beginning of the coast is to say that it starts at the continental divide, west of which the rivers run towards the Pacific, and along that ragged line in the Rocky Mountains, the west and far west split and cleave. Another way to say this is that the coast begins where the Coast Mountains in Canada, or the northern reaches of the Cascades, or the Sierra Nevada in the US are crossed. So this is the point where the dry country is abandoned for the wet. This might be one beginning of the beach. Or does the coastal region start instead literally where the water meets the land? There, the border between liquid and solid changes constantly with the waves and is muddled by deltas, estuaries, and tidal flats, so that the very geography of the place complicates our sense of where the land ends and where the water begins. Perhaps in Canada, the Pacific truly begins when the international borders are crossed from the north in Alaska or from the south in Washington. In other words, maybe we need the contrast of another country in order to throw into relief where we are at home. If physical geography renders beginnings and endings ambiguous, borders, such as the international border, attempts to simplify location and identity, neatly dividing here from there and us from them. But of course, conversations like the one we're having now show that those attempts to simplify things are arbitrary And although they are effective in some ways, they're ineffective in others. And of course, there are continuities that reach across international political borders as well. So the western extremity of British Columbia, where I live, from southern Vancouver Island to the border with southeastern Alaska, is delineated by the Pacific Ocean. And this, of course, is true for you in California as well. Even when my coastline becomes American near Alaska, the border is never very far from the water. All of Canada's western coast falls within British Columbia, but the province, the political jurisdiction, and the region are not synonymous, so that the ways in which different maps look are not equivalent or not identical. Coastal zones are narrow, as I've been saying, but the inland point at which the coast recedes from a literary or an artistic imagination is not absolute, so it's always possible to find coastal writers or coastal artists who don't themselves live on the coast, or they live far enough inland that the connection to the coastal region seems rather tenuous. And although shorelines and mountains and forests and geological faults appear to characterize the region that we all live in, geography itself is inconsistent. So Victoria lies in the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains, across the border in Washington. And despite the regional stereotypes of the Pacific Northwest, we get very little rain here. It's relatively dry compared to the cities of Vancouver or Seattle. So that the language of landscape and natural phenomena can be used by artists in certain ways, or writers, but these geographical stereotypes are not constant. Things are different depending on which locale you happen to live in. And forests, for example, are a useful illustration of this point, where depending on how you look at them, they can be examples of the paradises that I've been talking about, but they can also be places of work, so that here in the Northwest, there is a lot of writing and a lot of art about logging, which has been one of the economic forces that have driven development in this part of the world. Or they can be places of meeting between history and legend. And you can think of all of the ways in which other places like this are known, so that cities or non-urbanized places can all be known in a variety of ways, sometimes by name, sometimes by code. If you think of airport codes or the numerical codes that we use to measure latitude and longitude, places can be identified precisely, or they can be described in general or even vague ways. So that without geography, there can't be a regional literature or a regional art. But if we think of a coastal literature or a coastal art as including only novels, say, or paintings that are written or made within sight of the water, then we get a very trivial category, one that is highly restricted. So my suggestion in thinking about regional art and regional writing is that we need to be fluid in the way that we imagine this, and we need to try to find ways of understanding that artists and writers can engage with geography in profound ways that don't all look the same, so that the art or the literature that is produced from or by people who are engaging the same set of questions can take a variety of different shapes. And I would always want to try to pay attention to what is common as well as different between the various kinds of artworks that are produced. And so if I'm reading a poem about Canadian places on the Pacific, and you're studying a work of photography about Southern California, some of the differences may be obvious, but I would also want to think about what links them in certain ways. It's important, I think, to, as I was saying, understand the coast as a deeply historical place as well. And especially, I think, in the United States, California has been understood as the end of history, so that as American the continent, California was the final place. And so in some ways, Manifest Destiny was fulfilled when the United States reached the Pacific and California was brought into the Union in 1850, 1851. You can tell me later. I'm sure your instructor knows. But sometimes I think we forget this history and we think only of the West as a new place. But in thinking about the art and the writing of the Far West, I want to think about a much older history as well, which is useful for trying to get a sense of the Pacific as a much more complicated place than sometimes we give it credit for. And so in my part of the West Coast, in British Columbia, where English is the most common language, there are also more than 30 indigenous languages in the province. And these are varied and very different from each other. And some of these names may not be familiar to you. They're not familiar probably to most people who live here, but they are the oldest languages of the place. And so my work involves trying to come to terms with that linguistic and intercultural history and trying to understand what it means to think about the coast, not just as a place where English is spoken, but a place where Kwakwara or Haidaki or Tlingit or Smallgax or Senchothan or Nuksok are also all spoken. And paying attention to these linguistic and literary traditions is also a way of recognizing the place as a strange one, as a defamiliarizing region. And so this task is also pertinent in attending to the multilingual nature of the place in terms not just of indigenous languages, but of the languages that have come here since colonial times. And so it's not just that my British Columbia is a multilingual place in the sense of indigenous languages. It's also multilingual in the sense that English, Spanish, French, and Russian are the primary colonial languages. But it's also a place in which East Asian and Central Asian languages are widely spoken. And there are indeed various examples of dialects or pidgins that have emerged in this place so that people who speak different languages can communicate in some ways. And the lesson here, I think, for those of you who are working in contemporary arts is to try to attend to the complexity in social terms as well as in geographical terms of the place that you live in, and to think about how you can go about answering this question of what it means to be here by thinking about diversity in a variety of ways. And so for those of us who are working in literary art forms, this involves paying attention to local language. Right? What are the languages of this place? And what is the vocabulary or the lexicon of the place that we live in? And so one version of a regional idiom would include in the Pacific Northwest words like saltchuck and spar tree, tai and tideline. It's a vocabulary that includes words that reflect the historical and cultural and economic geographical conditions that make this place different from other parts of the world. And so a curriculum, I think, for coming to terms with the coast would be eclectic. It would include paying attention to these words, but it would also try to pay attention to the various kinds of records of engagement of this place. And so in literature, this might include the records of explorers and colonists who traveled here by land and by water. It would include the records of the gold rush and other economic frenzies, both past and present. And it would include the works of writers who have tried to retell this past in a variety of ways, sometimes as farce, parody, or tragedy, and sometimes, as I've been trying to suggest, as a kind of fantasy, as an invention of a new reality. And it would also involve paying attention to the perhaps irreconcilable ways in which the land itself has been the subject of competing legal and economic claims. So perhaps people, in some cases, don't or can't live here happily. Perhaps the contradictions of the place are so strong that it prevents the place from being understood as in fact, a coherent or indeed a happy place. So the very names of some coastal places in my part of the world reflect this sense of unhappiness. And if you travel in the Northwest, as Jesse can tell you, you'll come across a variety of places called Desolation or Deception, like Desolation Sound or Deception Pass or Mount Deception. And these names are artifacts of colonial exploration, but they reflect the sense, I think, of the difference between what the people who came here from Great Britain and Russia and Spain thought they were going to find and what they actually found. The place was not what they expected it to be, and they were usually disappointed that it was not the way they thought it was going to be. And in traveling around this part of the world today, those names, which are historical relics, are a useful reminder of how difficult it always is to interpret the place that you're in. And it's very rarely like the way you thought it was going to be, right? Places rarely live up to our preconceptions. And so part of being engaged in a regional art is trying to come to terms with why we have these expectations of place and how art can challenge them, and I think lead to a more profound and more meaningful sense of what it means to live somewhere. So although the coast, as I've been saying, has been thought of as an earthly paradise in many ways, it's also true that the coast has been thought of as a place of endings. And so there's often a fear of banishment or ruination that attends the art and the writing of the West Coast. And regional writers have often used the motif of expulsion from the garden in order to write about a variety of fears that they have that attend living on the West Coast. A fear that wilderness could be destroyed, for example, or even a fear that the world is going to end in the form of earthquakes or other natural disasters. So I just want to end by suggesting some of the ways that my version of the Northwest is a contradictory place in the way that I've been describing. And I think that some of these aspects will be unique to the northern reaches of the coastline, but in some ways, for example, earthquakes, there are continuities that extend from this part of the world to yours. And so in the Northwest, there are characteristic landscapes that Jesse and I have tried to explore, or at least to begin to do so. And so the coastline here is ragged. It's marked by fjords that carve the mainland and by innumerable islands that seem to punctuate the sea. And as that picture of Mount Rainier suggests, the coastline here is also defined by massive volcanoes that rise from sea level to 3,000, 4,000 meters, and by steep peaks in the coastal ranges where at great heights it is always winter, in contrast to the more temperate climates of the lower elevations. The arid hills and plateaus and the muted browns and greens of the inland regions across the mountains give a different sense of a local palette from the blues and greens and grays of the coast itself. And the lush, superfoliate, superabundant temperate rainforests in which the totemic Douglas firs, cedars, and hemlocks grow give us a sense of coherent place that ends when you get more or less to the Bay Area in California, and the characteristic vegetation changes in kind. But always there is the Pacific Ocean, which is the source and the defining characteristic of the region. And the coast, of course, has characteristic flora and fauna as well. Ravens and seagulls in the Northwest, salmon and the grizzlies that eat them, starfish and cougars and marmots and bald eagles. These elements of coastal life, I think, are conspicuous in regional art, and it's difficult to overstate their importance to the imaginative life of the Pacific Northwest. But these landscapes and the things and creatures that inhabit them are not only or not always celebrated, and a coastal art, I think, also has to be understood to include urban spaces, which would include not just some of the more familiar or iconic elements of Pacific cities, but also the forgotten spaces, the Chinatowns of here, Vancouver or Victoria, but also, of course, of San Francisco or LA, fishing colonies, internment camps, leper colonies, reserves and residential schools, trailer parks, logging camps, tackle shops, cafes, highways, strip malls, subdivisions. In all senses, this region contains multitudes, the place itself, as well as the artworks that it's created. And so if the Pacific is a captivating subject, as I think it is, it's also a very slippery subject. And part of the challenge for those of us who are working in this field, as well as those of you who are actually creating new art, is to try to come to terms with this question of definitions. So not, I think, just to try to advance a definition of the place, not just to answer the question, but also how to ask questions that are themselves more flexible and more fluid, and that might ultimately lead to significant answers about some of these questions that I've been trying to raise, which can all be grouped more or less under the broad question of what it means to be here. So I'll leave you with that, and I gather that I'll come back in a little while to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope that the next part of your class goes well.
Round of applause for Dr. Brown. That's a tough act to follow, and let me just summarize. I as you'll see in a moment, we'll have a more literal explanation of our methods. What Nick has done really wonderfully for us is really problematize the notion of the coast and of being here, which is obviously pertinent to all of our lives, whether we live here or in Victoria. So let's get rid of the feedback. And we'll hang up on Nick and we'll call him back in about 20 minutes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
How do we call him? Okay. Again, let me just sort of reiterate. One question you should all have already is like, what does this have to do, Jesse, what does this have to do with digital media? I mean, we signed up for digital media. You're talking to us about literature. And today's lecture is meant to expose you to, and many of the lectures are exposing you to how people who work in emerging forms of digital media intersect with people who work in maybe more traditional areas. In this case, Nick is a fairly, I wouldn't, traditional not the right word, but he's a literary scholar. He's a critic of a particular branch of literature that is focused on an area, the area we live in and the area he lives in. And what I do in this region is primarily act as a photographer in very simple ways, and increasingly as I enter into dialogue with Nick in more complex ways. So again, I'm going to kind of rush through this, but my practice, one part of my practice as an artist is characterized by composite photography. This is where we very quickly segue into digital media itself. So we have photography itself, and let's just mark this image as it's a classical, it's a representation of the coast. It's a vista. These are some of the things Nick referred to. This is how we understand the coast photographically. We take pictures of the horizon. And that's wonderful and fine and beautiful, and there's many examples of fabulous works of art that do this. But in the 21st century, one of the things I'm interested in is, well, what can we do differently? And certainly one of the very obvious things we can do is we can start to sort of patch things together and create representations that are not singular moments in time. Conventional, traditional film photography was always characterized by a very limited ability to capture multiple moments in time. You could slow things down, you could do multiple exposures, but it was always a bit of a kludge. And as any of you who have spent any time in Photoshop know, I mean, this is four bits of me in a 360-degree panorama of the coastal condition that I grew up in, because Nick and I grew up in the same town. So that's sort of a summary. And just to sort of one step further, one of the other things I do in my practice is composite multiple positions in space in addition to multiple moments in time in a space. So this is every Best Buy in Orange County as a single image, and we'll talk about this in a second. But this is a very quick summary of like, how do we get into digital media with this? And what Nick and I are trying to do is understand does what I do have anything to offer the questions that he's asking about the coast, and the questions that, as a consequence of our collaboration, I am beginning to ask as well. So I'm really, like, Nick did an awesome job of setting the scene for the questions that we're trying to ask and how complicated those questions actually are. So just a quick summary of me. I kind of step into photography as an architectural photographer in a professional way. So this is just a variety of images showing what professional architectural photography looks like, spaces and occupation of those spaces shot in a particular style. And one of the things, and we're going to start to tease out how this informs my artistic practice. Well, one of the things that I consistently had to do as a working in this way is, well, that you need people and there's nobody there. So Jesse, you got to go stand in your own photo, which we start to see. So this is a picture of me in a space. It's not because anybody cares about me. It's because nobody's handy and available. And so then weird things happen, and firms who hire me to take these photos will then publish those images, and I wind up in strange places. I'm kind of retired from the business of photography in favor of this more scholarly version of it. And one of the projects I carry forward in my research practice is one focused on, or a series of projects focused on specific sites in the world. One of those sites is the kind of modern towers that many people live in. And the city that I come from, most recently is Toronto, is strongly characterized by this type of building. And it's a very curious building type. These exist in LA as well. They're less common. But in the East Coast cities, you'll find lots of decaying modern structures that that house, in the case of Toronto, people out of 4 million. And what I've been discovering with imagery of place, and this is where we'll get back to the coast, imagery of place has an impact on anybody who occupies that place. And the people who occupy those places are of a variety of types. You have the people who live in the buildings, and then you have the architects that work on them, and then you have the civic officials who are interested in the future of these buildings. All of these things translate into all studies of place. You have these multiple stakeholders. We call them stakeholders. We could call them user groups. We could just call them interested parties. But they all have different agendas. And so these slides represent how people with different agendas use the images in service of their agendas. And so again, as a professional photographer, I have people who, can I use your image to do this? And so yeah, you want to illustrate poverty in Toronto? Okay, sure. That's not what I meant to do. But if that's how you see this image, and if that's how you understand this place through image, then that's I'm cool with that. And this kind of became a separate project. It was like, hey, this is a poster from a conference. I'm like, I'm a person. I take pictures of towers, and so if you're interested in towers in any way possible, come talk to me about what my imagery can do for you. What turned out to be unique is that nobody was shooting these towers in a way that was positive. They tend to be seen as I'm sort of not doing that project justice, but in summary, they tend to be seen as blighted spaces, but of course they're not. They're very complicated spaces. In the process of working on tower photography, one of the things I realized was that, like many things in urban space, there's a lot of repetition. So this is a building that repeats itself in the same site. I mean, that was not the same building, but they're all exactly the same because they built 5 of them. And this led to a more composite practice. I use the word composite to describe any form of photography that overlays or adds together data from multiple images. I mean, this is certainly one of the most immediate consequences of digital photography is the ease with which we can collapse images into, even when you press the HDR button on your phone, it's taking 3 images and smashing them together. I mean, this is something that all of you guys kind of live out every day with technology. But this is a relatively recent thing. It was sufficiently complicated to do this even 10 years ago that nobody did it. It wasn't like an everyday practice. It was very specialized. This led to a follow-up project where another collaborator and I captured various common sites in the city of Toronto: gas stations, Home Depots. The beer store is a thing that only exists in Canada, where you buy beer, obviously. And it's a socialist country thing. You can only buy beer at government-owned stores. That's what they called it, the beer store. So it's an iconic building. And the purpose of these projects, or this evolution of the composite project, is meant to take iconic spaces and try to understand them collectively. So you've got a bunch of Best Buys in town. What do they look like when they're all mashed together? It is a very simple question. It's a fairly simple technique. I could show you in a couple of hours how I do this. Some of you probably can already figure it out. That's not the point. The point is, what does this do to our understanding of this place? If we add these all together, what are the consequences of the sum total of every Best Buy in town? Some of the things you start to notice is how the architectural elements repeat, and which ones do and which ones don't. It turns out that these branded structures are characterized by a very strong allegiance to making sure the brand is presented the same way everywhere. So the beer store always has the same opening. The Home Depot sort of doesn't, and these are the interesting variations. And again, I'm going to kind of skip through this project in favor of the getting to the coastal version of it. Other examples of composite photography of this type focused on specific sites. In this case, the shelter of a street. This is a streetcar in Toronto, like San Francisco streetcar, a very similar streetcar. And so this brings us to my collaboration with Nick. And I'm trying to foreground this, and Nick is foregrounding the conversation, and what does he do with literature? What he does with literature, well, he is an expert in literature of the West Coast, particularly modern literature of the West Coast. My expertise is in representations of place through composite photography in the case of this collaboration. And I recently relocated to California, and so the first application of the project is the one that you saw. This is every Best Buy between here and, well, in Orange County, and this is what they look like all together. And what we thought was, well, what does this technique offer to an understanding of coastal place? This is the West Coast. This is the coast of North America, and these are the two places that we occupy. Nick lives in Victoria. I live in Newport. Well, I don't live in Newport, but it's the closest beach to where I live, which is just on campus, basically. And you see, so one of the things that's worth pointing out, because Nick pointed it out, is the difference between the coastal condition that begins somewhere north of San Francisco, but really starts to take off in the Victoria region, where the coast becomes literally jagged at a massive scale. The coast in our part of the country is quite smooth, although of course we also know that it's full of inlets and outlets and rivers and various other complexities. So it's an interesting macro-micro comparison. It turns out that Newport and Victoria have some interesting similarities. They're both roughly the same size. They were both colonized in roughly the same year. They have indigenous inhabitants. This is where Victoria is, just to give you, because you all know where Newport is, so won't provide you with that map. But this is Vancouver Island, adjacent to Vancouver. Vancouver is not on Vancouver Island. This is the island, and this is Seattle down here. So this is a nice map because it locates us relative to the United States. They have a kind of estuary condition. And so again, we see this commonality. I hadn't thought of these as common places, but they just happen to have these coincidental conditions. So it become a good test bed for, if we're going to ask questions about the coast, we're going to try to compare life on the coast in two very different regions, and yet very similar regions. These become good choices. And they're also both characterized by students, sailors, and old people. This is like Victoria and Newport are retirement communities full of marinas, and they both have a large university in them that kind of acts as a contrast to the latter two. So that's also interesting. This isn't true in many other cities. So here we have Newport. So let's just talk about what we did, and this is where my part of the project or the nature of the collaboration becomes quite literal. If we're going to talk about the coast, well, then the obvious thing to do is to make sure that we've occupied the entire coast. So this is the entire length of the municipal boundaries of Newport Beach. And similarly, Victoria is part of a much larger community involving other cities like Oak Bay. And so this is the continuous length of the coast of the municipal boundaries of Victoria. I have to skip ahead here in the name of time. Nick talked for way longer than he was supposed to. So he's really created a problem for me. But I want to make one point, which is just to reinforce Nick's observation that coasts are complicated. That's all he said. This is a map of the coast. This is a map of a city, and this is a very important observation about the nature of maps that we use every day. Is they are dramatic simplifications of what space is like. They emphasize the things we care about. We care about roads. We care about the locations of parks. What we don't care about as people occupying space is we don't really care about what happens here at the edge, because we don't occupy that space very often, unless it's at a park. Here's the one place where we're going to engage with the edge. And in the case of Vancouver, it's a great example. You see, if you look at the satellite image, the equivalent satellite image, just how amorphous the coast actually is. This is a massive tidal flat that you can walk out on. You can't build on it. It's not safe. It's like it's a space that could flood, but it's multiple miles wide. It's like empty space. It's no man's land. These kinds of observations about maps are important to my practice because These are two maps by Buckminster Fuller that show how the world is a connected unit, and how, in fact, the coast is one continuous line around the entire world. We don't see this map because it's not useful for navigation. But as a map, but as a way of reinforcing the connected nature of the landmass of the world and the connected nature of the oceans of the world. Again, if you fold this into a ball, you do get the Earth. And this just really complicates the nature of the oceans. I mean, where's the Pacific here? I mean, it's sort of impossible to find. We have to wrap somewhere over there. But of course, the Pacific and the Atlantic and all these oceans are completely continuous. So I show these to you to reinforce the complexity of thinking about the coast as a condition. These are just meant to show you that the cities that we're looking at are more complicated than we let on. The city of Victoria is a kind of meaningless construction. It's this thing here. But it's part of a network of cities. It's part of a larger region. And similarly, in Newport's case, Newport's a funny city. It's been colonizing neighboring cities for years. It took over this green space in 2001. It didn't used to be part of Newport. So we want to be aware of the fact that when we select a coastal region, we have to be careful of about how we select it. It's not necessarily meaningful to pick Newport's boundaries, but we did ultimately do so for the sake of consistency between the two locations. And then lastly, as Nick alluded to, both of these places, Victoria, and we saw the map of Victoria earlier showing some of the native names, have indigenous populations. The indigenous populations in Victoria are more pronounced today. California's indigenous populations, by and large, no longer exist. I mean, most of them are dead today. Because of the nature of colonization in the two places, they have different relationships with their indigenous populations, but there are still place names and historical locations that are pertinent to the Juanitos and the Gabrielinos. Recognize those names, right? Gabrielino is a street around here, but it's also the colonial name for an indigenous people that no longer exists, or exists in very limited numbers today. We're going to skip over a number of artists who informed the work. Pausing briefly for Arts 11's sake, of course, all of this relates to Hockney and Nishino, Jim Campbell. These are other artistic practices that use composite photography to illustrate an idea. This is every frame in Hitchcock's Psycho. This is an artist named Corinne Vianette who takes snapshots of famous locations from the internet and then mashes them together into a single image. So this is like every view of the Parthenon. So I want to make sure that people realize. I mean, some of you know this already. Artists don't exist in a vacuum. Anything that I do and Nick and I do together has to relate to, or automatically relates to, anybody else who practices in a similar way. And one of the burdens as a creator of visual work is to understand that relationship, or at least be aware of it, so that you can sort of use that dialogue productively. Basically, this project was a huge pain in the ass. Because what it required me to do is, while Nick was watching, Nick alludes to how slow the walk was. Well, this is why it was so slow. Standing in the edge of the water, and the whole idea was to stand right where the water crosses the land. And this immediately becomes impossible, because the water doesn't cross the land at a consistent location. And then I have to set the camera up. Joel he gets it. He's been standing here with the camera trying to get it perfect. I got a bunch of still can't get it wet. This is a bag of water weighing the camera down so it doesn't move. And so it's funny when Nick talks about how bored he was. I didn't know he was bored because I wasn't bored. I was busy the whole time. And he's standing there taking videos of me and pictures of me. So we're going to work on ways to make the collaboration a bit more fulfilling for him. But the first step was to create panoramic images with smooth water. These are the technical problems that we were trying to solve, of a variety of locations around Victoria's coastline. One of the things that occurs as a result of Nick being there is that he exists in every image, and this became something we decided to celebrate. If you're going to take a panoramic image of everything around you, what I would do when I stood on the coastline was I would shoot 360 degrees, and then we turn them into a long image. And so Nick, of course, he's always present, and that's relevant to the project because he is the local expert of the site, and we would spend the walking periods of the project talking through some of the issues, some of the things we would notice about various sites. As Nick alluded to, one of the consistent things we noticed was that we've never been to parts of this coast. Both Nick and I are familiar with Victoria. I grew up there. I haven't lived there in a long time, but you don't actually walk the entire length of any coast. That's a fairly rare thing to do, partly because it's hard. There's a bunch of docks in the way and private space and fences and rocks and things that just don't make it possible. So that was interesting. The way that we experience the coast is very, very localized and quite narrow, in fact. I mean, if you guys think about where you go to the beach, you go to the beach at a few points. But how many of you, and you probably walked along a stretch of the beach, but has anybody walked the entire length of Orange County's coastline? Well, no, because it would take you multiple days. I mean, you'd have to spend a week doing it, when you'd have to camp out and you'd probably die along the way. It would be hard to do. This is just alluding to the technical problem of smoothing the water. So this is a shot from Newport. I'm going to skip over that for a second, come back to it. So these are all of the images that we shot. I do apologize for having to rush this. And by the time we got to here, this is a kind of iconic location on the Victoria's coastline. I started to become uncomfortable with something photographic, which is that very quickly images like this reduce to what I would call a visual cliche. This may well be a wonderful image that we want to use as our desktop background, but as an artist, I'm not interested in producing more images that kind of glorify the coast and have this. I mean, it's a complex problem. I find this to be both beautiful and troublesome because it's so generically similar to every other type of landscape photography that has existed. We talked about Ansel Adams as a historical figure in landscape photography, and that type of work, this is in color, starts to inform everything that comes after that. And so I'm just worried about things once meaningful, now overused to the point of being trite. I mean, luckily, most of the sites have a kind of unusual construction that sort of evade the problem easily. And this is what happens when you mash them up. And I want to say that the first thing I thought is like, that's kind of boring. I'm not into that. I'm disappointed. And I'm disappointed because I've been working on images like this and that have a more consistent, maybe registration, where things are revealed more easily. And so I thought about, well, why don't I like this as much as I like this? One of the other burdens of being a visual artist is you do have to decide whether something works or doesn't work. Does this fit as part of your output? If you're a musician, you write a song, you don't like the song, you don't release it. And so every time you finish a photograph, you have to think, is this something I want to put out into the world? And maybe I do and maybe I don't. But what I'm noticing is I don't like it as much as this one, and probably because I can see things in this image. I'm rewarded by close examination. There's all these different cars and different pavement patterns, and I'm starting to see how the way that Best Buy organizes space, and I'm not seeing how the coastline organizes space here. I'm not learning anything from the exercise. Going back to an artist that we looked at last quarter, Jason Salavon, this is an overlay of 100 graduations. And what it reveals is how generic that event is and how commonplace it is that we can go and collect images of 100 graduations and they all have the same composition. That's an interesting quality. Salavon also creates a work called Every House for Sale in Chicagoland. And I think this has the same problem. I don't find this to be interesting. It has a kind of gauzy, what do you want to call this, impressionist quality, but it doesn't really tell me, it doesn't speak to me as an artist. And so I think he's struggling with the same problem, where which of these works are successful and which of them aren't. And just Jim Campbell. So Jim Campbell, I think, even though it's gauzy, it works because the moment you know that this is Hitchcock's Psycho, you're like, that's awesome. Like, how cool is that we're going to take every frame? And then actually what you do see is you see the lamp, and it's like, okay, a lot of the movie happens in one spot. And so again, for me, I am interested in there being a certain complexity to what the work can reveal. And then similar, if we go back to Vignette, we see, well, this is something where there's a really strong gesture compositionally in the center, which is something we can really focus on and try to understand. So the solution, or at least the tentative solution, this is early work, we're not finished working on this project, was to separate the image into two positions, realizing that the coast actually had two very different states. There was an inner coastline and a harbor, and an outer coastline that kind of faced the ocean. And in doing so, they became themselves compositions that we could compare and contrast. So this is called Victoria's Coast Inner Harbor and Outer Harbor, and they're meant to say beside each other or be printed. They actually are roughly, when they're printed, they're almost this big. They're 8 feet long, so they're a little bit shorter. And there would be 2 of them. And that's the end of the project. The last thing that I thought I would show you is that we're still working on the Newport part of the project, still solving some of the technical problems. But because you guys are from here, I thought you'd be interested in seeing this maybe more, and as Nick has alluded to, maybe a more benign coastal condition that's characterized by different occupation. We don't have this kind of dock condition in Victoria. It's the water is too rough. There's different coloration. And this is kind of an early mashup, as we'll call them, of images from Newport. Thank you. If you want. Okay, so like I said, this is a bit of a test. In future lectures, we won't have this me and somebody else, so it'll go. I don't think we'll run out of time, but I'm actually glad to learn that we have to be very sensitive to time. And this is the reason why when you come in, we will do the participation question very quickly. But let's call Nick back because we said we would. We have 5 minutes, and maybe who wants to ask? We'll see how many questions we can get through, but who has a burning question of the 3 that volunteered? Burning. I see burning. Okay. Nick, you're back.
Hi.
We have about 3 minutes for questions, and we have a question asking volunteer who I will point the camera at. Take it away.
Just had a question. You talked a lot about contradictions with your work. Have you ever talked about or researched the contradictions of the environment with, for example, Florida on the East Coast had a shark attack that prevents, even though people want to be there on the coast, it kind of prevents them from being there. Or a couple years ago, we had a huge biofilm hazard that we weren't able to go to the beaches. Have you researched or discussed anything about the contradictions in that sense?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, there's a lot of unhappiness in any place, and there's always a lot of people who don't want to live in a certain location that may not come out in art or writing so much, because I think people who write about places tend to be genuinely interested, if not excited about the places. But certainly, it's possible, I think, not just to think of, the kinds of episodes that you're talking about, but of broader histories of dispossession. And so, on the West Coast, some examples that would come to mind would be, the forced removal of various peoples from their lands, or histories of forced labor, or labor in less than ideal circumstances, or internment, or so on. And so, all of those historical examples would suggest to me ways in which the idea of a coast as a happy place to live would be completely eviscerated.
Thank you.
One follow-up answer to that. One of the things that the visual aspect of the project immediately highlights is just how limited. I mean, we talked about how last quarter, for those of you who weren't here, we had a quote from a writer on photography, Fred Ritchen, who talks about how the entire Vietnam War, every photograph taken of Vietnam War is about 18 seconds total. So we've got 18 seconds of 5 years represented in image. And similarly, in terms of occupying space, I mean, we don't painstakingly photograph until literally the last 5 years, we actually don't painstakingly photograph every aspect of a space. One of the first, this Google Street View is one of the first attempts to comprehensively catalog the length of every street, and it's a very different type of imagery than photography that conventional or traditional photography that's more limited in scope. It's we're going to pick one thing to show, and the point of me saying this or bringing this up is we have to actually choose to document the unhappy places or the unhappy moments of the coastline, and maybe the question would be well, how do we even do that? How do you represent visually the shark attack? And you could. Coast is empty. That would be an unexpected condition in Florida, which is you would think the beach is full and it's not, and then that maybe asks the question in some way. What I like about what we're doing, or what I enjoy about it, is not so much that I think it's valuable yet. I think it's very tentative work so far, is that we're we're very quickly arriving at some very basic questions about the nature of these places and how we can represent them and understand them in ways that are different than how they've been understood historically. I think we have time for one more. We had 3 volunteers and you're all shy all of a sudden. Come on, you volunteered. Oh, shoot. You can stand up there. I don't think you have to move.
Okay, yeah.
I think I've lost Nick, though.
No, I'm done here.
Oh, I just lost you. Where'd you go? We can't see you is the problem.
All right.
There you are. Nope. Okay, well, we're not going to see your face, Nick. You're just going to be there.
Oh, okay. So, I noticed how you were talking about how certain places were given names that kind of already give this sort of stigma that, like, okay, it's just going to be a sort of dead, desolate place. So, what kind of names would you give these places in order to make them more appealing to those traveling around those areas?
Jesse, can you give me a
Yeah, so the question is, would you rename Desolation Sound?
Oh yeah, no, I like the old names. I mean, I think it's, I was talking about places as being contradictory. I think it's helpful for places to be contradictory. But one thing that I think is interesting is a tendency up here for renamed in names that come from local indigenous languages, and it's easy to think that that's a kind of an empty gesture or simply an exercise in generating tourism interest. But I think the less cynical way of viewing that is to take renaming as a reminder that names and what maybe sound in one language or in one time is or was called something else in another language and at another time. And the more that we can all remember that places have different names and therefore different identities, the better we're able to get a sense of the diversity of places, but also their inherent complexity.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you to our questioners. We have to clear out because there's another class in 10 minutes, so we'll see you all on Tuesday.